It depends on to whom it is given, and under what circumstances it is given, and by whom it is given. In other words, the function of the chemical is purely instrumental. Here you've got a gorgeous piano made by Steinway Company. Beautiful, crazy. And anybody who knows nothing about playing the piano can flitter his fingers around on the Steinway, and it produces sounds that are essentially in themselves excellent, because the piano is a fine instrument, but they are not ordered in any kind of musical coherence. Give the same instrument to an expert, and he uses it marvelously. And it's exactly the same thing with psychedelic chemicals. Anybody can have a ball with them, just like anybody can have a ball looking through a microscope or a telescope. But not everyone can use them to produce religious experience or profound aesthetic experience, or, as in many cases, scientific inventiveness. It depends on what you bring to it, what you get out of it. So we must regard these things as very strictly instrumental. They do not do for you anything which you yourself, in a way, don't bring to it. But there always is naturally the temptation to feel that salvation lies in the bottle, salvation lies in the pill, and if we only could take this thing, we should somehow be transported. And that this is not the case is proved by the increasing number of people who have taken what I'll call street acid under the worst sort of circumstances, not knowing what it's even made of, what the dosage is, and having no regard to the conditions in which it is taken, and have had the so-called famous bad trips. Of course. And I must underline the fact, don't use street acid. You don't know what it is. Of course, if you're willing to play Russian roulette and you're willing to take all sorts of gambles, I suppose it's a free country. But it really isn't very sensible. You can take risks which are not under your control, and you don't know what to do with it. On the other hand, when we consider from a social point of view what we're going to do about this, it isn't simply that there is lysergic acid of some sort running around on the streets in the black market, mescaline, psilocybin, dimethyltryptamine, but also, of course, our old friend, marijuana. Which, here there's no particular question about whether it's bad marijuana. It's just a vegetable. And what should be public policy with regard to these things? I feel very strongly that in a country where we value freedom, we must not attempt to legislate morality, especially morality that is simply the concern of the individual towards himself. In other words, going back to even the basic religious ideas about moral behavior, it's fundamental to both Jewish and Christian thinking that an action is not significantly moral if it's done under compulsion. In other words, if you stay faithful to your wife merely because you are afraid of the consequences of adultery, you are not a truly faithful husband. If you give alms to the poor merely in order to get yourself a place in heaven, or on the roster of donors to the synagogue, you are not truly charitable. So it is of the essence of moral behavior according to Jewish and Christian theology, that it be voluntary. So that any moral behavior which is enforced is not moral behavior as a result of enforcement. And the only reason for enforcing any moral behavior is that immoral behavior may in certain circumstances cause grave inconvenience to others, as murdering people, as robbing them, as mugging them on the streets. That, we are, I think, agreed, ought to be prevented by the police. But when it comes to whether you will gamble, whether you will have irregular sexual games, whether you will change your state of consciousness by alcohol, by tobacco, by sleeping pills, by aspirin, by caffeine, by lysergic acid, you have a certain responsibility to judge for yourself. Because if you're deprived of that responsibility, of what other responsibilities might you also be deprived for your own good? What you read? Ought you to read the works of Karl Marx? Mr. Rafferty didn't think so. And yet, how would you know what to do about a communist enemy if you didn't understand the philosophy of Marx? How do you know how to deal with China unless you've read everything written by Mao Zedong? You've got to understand your enemy, if enemy he must be. So, responsibility implies a certain freedom to take risks and to make adventures. It's very dangerous, it could have been said, to go up in the air in a machine. The Wright brothers took a grave risk. Why, if they had crashed, what would have happened to their wives and children? Would they have been a care of the state? Therefore, the Wright brothers should not have been allowed to fly that airplane. And so, in the same way, you might go mad, and your wives and children no longer have your support if you took certain adventures in consciousness. It's the same problem. So, does the state have the right to tell you that there are certain risks you mustn't take? If the state does assume that responsibility, it can't be helped that the state is also saying at the same time that we must not make experiments which could possibly result in great benefits to mankind. We don't know whether they will result in this or not. The knowledge about this whole thing is not as yet certain, but we at least have the right to make the attempt. But I suggest that we don't make that attempt in absolutely undisciplined and uncontrolled situations. That the opposition to the use of these chemicals by politicians who are simply collecting votes and arousing all the little old ladies terrified by sensational stories in the press, that's all that is. But the fact remains, the hard core of the fact is, that if we are going to take dangerous adventures of this kind, it should be done absolutely out in the open, with the assistance of the best scientific and psychological and religious wisdom that is available. If we send people out into space in our astronauts, we have the whole scientific faculty of the country behind them. Likewise, if we're going to send people into inner space, instead of being something that is done sub rosa, in a paranoid, guilty atmosphere, it should be something in which we openly cooperate with the feeling we are holding your hand and we're with you all the way. But it isn't being done like that. And we are going through the same problem that we have been going through in this country for years, and you may be, as I am, very anxious that there be law and order in this country, that there be respect for our policemen. But respect for our policemen in this country ceased when Prohibition came into effect, because the officers of the law were asked to enforce things that the citizenry simply were not going to observe. They became